Shattered vows, a love betrayed and reclaimed. The restaurant was dimly lit, the golden glow of candlelight reflecting off the polished mahogany tables. A gentle hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware against fine china. The aroma of roasted garlic and simmering tomato sauce wrapped around me like a familiar embrace, but tonight it did nothing to comfort me. Andrea sat across from me, the candle between us flickering as if uncertain whether to burn steady or die out entirely. I had always loved the way the soft light played against her skin, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the delicate curve of her lips. But tonight, something was different. Her eyes, normally so full of warmth, seemed distant, like she was here and yet somewhere else entirely. I set down my wine glass, swirling the last remnants of deep red liquid as I studied her. "You've barely touched your food," I said lightly, though my stomach twisted with something I couldn't yet name. "And you've been staring at that glass for the last 10 minutes like it holds the meaning of life." She let out a soft breath, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass before setting it down with careful precision. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, her voice quiet. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the first stirrings of unease. "About what?" She hesitated. A flicker of something, guilt, maybe, crossed her face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "About us." A lead weight settled in my chest. I had been expecting a conversation about work, or maybe something about our weekend plans. Not this. "Okay," I said slowly. "What about us?" Andrea inhaled deeply, like she was gathering her courage. She reached across the table, fingers brushing against mine, but there was something hesitant about it, like she wasn't sure if she still had the right to touch me. "I love you, Rob. You know that, right?" "Of course," I said, though a cold whisper of dread curled around the edges of my mind. She nodded, almost to herself, then withdrew her hand. "But I need something more," she said finally. "Something different." The words hung between us, fragile and dangerous. I frowned. "I don't understand." Andrea exhaled slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress as if stalling for time. When she looked up again, there was a raw honesty in her eyes that made my skin prickle. "I want to see other people." The restaurant around us faded. The soft laughter of other diners, the clinking of glasses, the romantic strains of a violin playing somewhere in the background. It all dissolved into a dull hum, like white noise behind the sharp ringing in my ears. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "You want to what?" "I want to explore," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I feel like I need to do this. For myself." I let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over my jaw. "So let me get this straight," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "You want to sleep with other people, but you still won't be with me?" She flinched. "It's not just about sex, Rob." "Isn't it?" "No," she insisted. "It's about self-discovery, about figuring out who I really am." A sharp, bitter taste filled my mouth. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Where do I fit into this little journey of self-discovery?" Andrea's throat bobbed as she swallowed, her hands twisting in her lap. I thought we were strong enough for this," she said, almost pleading. "I thought you'd understand." Understand. She wanted me to understand that the woman I had devoted years of my life to, the woman I had built a future with, wanted the freedom to be with other men while keeping me safely on the sidelines. My fingers curled into a fist on the table. "How long have you been thinking about this?" She hesitated. "Too long." "Andrea," I pressed, my stomach nodding. "Are you already seeing someone?" "No," she said quickly. "I swear, Rob, this isn't about another man. It's about me. About what I need." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "And what if I said no?" She bit her lip, and for the first time that night, I saw real fear in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, "but I don't want to lie to you either. This is something I have to do." A cold silence stretched between us. I reached for my wine glass and took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. "You know what, Andrea?" I said finally, setting the glass down with a quiet clink. "I'm glad you were honest with me. I really am." Her shoulders sagged in relief. Then I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, measured tone. "But if you think I'm the kind of man who's going to sit around and wait while you find yourself in someone else's bed, you don't know me at all." Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching in her throat. I stood up, pulling a few bills from my wallet and tossing them onto the table. "Enjoy your self-discovery, Andrea," I said, grabbing my coat. Then, without looking back, I walked out of the restaurant into the cold night air. And just like that, the life I had built came crashing down around me. The cold night air hit me like a slap. Sharp, unforgiving. I barely noticed. My thoughts were a whirlwind, a chaotic mess of disbelief, anger, and something deeper, something like grief. The kind that comes when you realize the person you love isn't who you thought they were. I walked blindly, barely aware of where I was going. The streets of the city stretched out before me, bathed in the glow of neon lights and the distant hum of traffic. Laughter spilled from bars, couples strolled hand in hand, a reminder that somewhere, love was still simple, still whole. But not for me. Andrea's words echoed in my head, a relentless loop. "I need to explore. This will make me a better wife. I thought we were strong enough for this." I clenched my jaw. What the hell did she expect me to say? "Sure, honey, go sleep with other men. I'll be right here, waiting like a loyal dog." The sheer arrogance of it made my stomach twist. I stopped walking, pressing a hand to my forehead. I needed to think. Andrea and I had been together for 8 years, married for 5. We had built a life together, holidays, lazy Sundays, shared dreams about a future that, until tonight, I thought we both wanted. And now, she wanted something else. Someone else. The idea made my stomach churn. A gust of wind blew down the street, cutting through my coat, but I barely felt it. My legs carried me forward without thought, without direction, until I found myself outside a bar. Not one of the sleek, modern cocktail lounges Andrea liked. This was a real bar, the kind with dim lighting, sticky floors, and a bartender who looked like he'd seen it all. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was half full, the low murmur of conversation blending with the occasional clink of glasses. I slid onto a bar stool, my body moving on autopilot. The bartender, a grizzled man in his 50s with tired eyes, walked over. "What'll it be?" "Whiskey." "Neat." He nodded, grabbed a bottle from the shelf, and poured a generous amount into a short glass. I wrapped my fingers around it, staring at the amber liquid for a long moment before taking a slow sip. It burned. Good. I exhaled, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "You look like a man with something on his mind," the bartender said, wiping down the counter. I let out a dry chuckle. "You have no idea." He shrugged. "I've been tending bar for 20 years. I've heard it all. Woman trouble." I took another sip. "Something like that." The bartender didn't push. He just nodded, moving down the bar to serve someone else. I appreciated that. I pulled my phone from my pocket, staring at the screen. No messages from Andrea. No missed calls. For a split second, I considered texting her. "Are you serious about this? Do you really think we can come back from this?" But I didn't, because deep down, I already knew the answer. I stared at my reflection in the mirror behind the bar, the man looking back at me seeming older than he had that morning. Had I missed the signs? Had Andrea been pulling away for months, years? Or had I just been too blind to see it? I drained the rest of my whiskey and signaled for another. Tonight, I didn't want answers. I just wanted to forget. The apartment felt different without Andrea in it. It wasn't just the physical absence. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her perfume still lingered in the air, but something deeper, something intangible. Like the very walls had absorbed her presence. And now, Without her, they felt hollow. I sat on the couch, a half-empty glass of whiskey in my hand, staring at the flickering light from the street lamp outside. It cast shifting shadows on the walls, distorting familiar shapes into something unrecognizable. What's on my life now? 2 weeks had passed since the dinner, since Andrea dropped the bombshell that shattered the foundation of our marriage, since I walked away. She had texted, called, left voicemails filled with apologies and pleas to talk. I hadn't answered. I didn't know what to say. My entire life, I had believed in loyalty, in commitment. I wasn't naive. I knew relationships weren't perfect, but I had always thought that when two people vowed to be together, to build something, they meant it. Then no matter how difficult things got, you fought for what you had. Andrea didn't want to fight. She wanted to explore. I downed the rest of the whiskey in one long gulp, letting the burn distract me from the ache in my chest. A soft knock at the door shattered the silence. I frowned, setting the glass down. It was nearly midnight. For a second, I considered ignoring it, letting whoever was assume I wasn't home. But something told me I already knew who it was. I pushed off the couch and made my way to the door, my pulse steady, but my hands tight with tension. When I pulled it open, there she was. Andrea. She looked like hell. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying for hours. Her hair was loose, slightly disheveled, as if she had run her fingers through it too many times. She wore an oversized hoodie, one of mine, I realized, and a pair of leggings. No makeup, no facade. Just her. Just the woman I had loved for 8 years, standing on my doorstep, looking as lost as I felt. Rob, she said softly. I exhaled slowly, gripping the doorframe. What are you doing here, Andrea? She swallowed hard. I needed to see you. I studied her, tried to ignore the way my chest tightened at the sight of her. We don't have anything to talk about. She flinched, her fingers tightening around the sleeves of her hoodie. Please, just let me in. 5 minutes. That's all I ask. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to close the door, to protect myself. But the part of me that still loved her, that still wanted to understand, kept me from doing it. With a slow sigh, I stepped aside. She walked in hesitantly, like she wasn't sure she belonged here anymore. Maybe she didn't. I shut the door behind her and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. Say what you need to say. Andrea took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting. I've been thinking, she started, voice trembling slightly. About everything. About us. And she broke off, her throat working as she struggled for words. Rob, I'm messed up. I arched a brow. That's an understatement. She let out a shaky breath, nodding. I know I hurt you. And I know I don't deserve anything from you right now. But I need you to know it wasn't about not loving you. Really, my voice was cold, because that's exactly what it felt like. She winced. I ran a hand through my hair, shaking my head. You chose this, Andrea. You chose to throw everything we built away. For what? Some fantasy about finding yourself? It wasn't a fantasy, she whispered. It was fear. I frowned. Fear of what? She met my gaze, her eyes glistening. Fear of settling. Fear of waking up one day and realizing I never really lived before I tied myself down forever. I was terrified that if I didn't do this now, I'd resent it later. Resent you. I let out a bitter laugh, pushing off the counter. So, your solution was to betray me? To break everything we had? I didn't want to break us. Her voice cracked. I thought we could survive it. That you'd understand. Understand? My voice rose, anger bubbling up. Understand that my wife wanted to sleep with other people while keeping me on a leash? That I was supposed to just be okay with it. Andrea's face crumpled. I see now that it was selfish, she admitted. That I wasn't thinking about how it would make you feel. I was so consumed with me that I didn't see what I was doing to us. I stared at her, my chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. So why are you here now? Her lip trembled. Because I miss you. I exhaled sharply, closing my eyes for a moment. You don't get to miss me, Andrea. You chose this. You made your decision. I know, she whispered, and I regret it. Every second of every day. Silence stretched between us. A heavy, painful silence. Finally, I spoke, my voice quieter this time. Did you do it? Her brow furrowed. Do what? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Did you sleep with someone else? Her breath hitched. A long pause. Then, finally, no. Something inside me loosened. Just a little. I studied her, searching for any sign of a lie. But all I saw was raw, unfiltered sorrow. Andrea stepped closer, hesitantly reaching for my hand. I love you, Rob. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't want to lose you. I looked down at her fingers, barely brushing against mine. Part of me ached to pull her in, to hold her, to pretend none of this had happened. But the other part, the part still raw, still bleeding, wasn't ready to forget. I pulled my hand away. I don't know if I can trust you again. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I understand. Another silence. Then, with a deep breath, Andrea turned to leave. But just before she reached the door, she paused. If you ever believe we could fix this, please just tell me. She didn't wait for a response. She opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and disappeared. And for the first time since she had left, since this entire nightmare had begun, I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter, taunting me. Thick, cream-colored, the kind you see at weddings or high-end galas. Definitely not the kind of thing I was used to getting in the mail. There was no return address, just my name, written in Andrea's delicate cursive. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. After that disastrous dinner, I'd buried myself in work, in the gym, in anything that would keep me from thinking about the wreckage of my marriage. The first few nights had been the hardest, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of her key in the lock. But it never came. And now here it was. A letter. An invitation, maybe? To what? A reconciliation? A final goodbye? I stared at it for a moment longer, then tore it open. Inside was a single card, thick and expensive. At the top, embossed in gold lettering, were the words, "A night of exploration and desire." I frowned, my pulse quickening. Below, a handwritten note. Rob, I know this isn't what you expected, but if you truly want to understand me, if you want to see what I see, come to this address. Tomorrow night, 9 p.m. No expectations. Just see for yourself. Andrea. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the meaning would change. A night of exploration and desire. I didn't need to be a genius to figure out what that meant. Some kind of party. Some kind of what? Swinger thing? An open relationship gathering? A place where people like Andrea could explore while their partners looked the other way? I felt sick. And yet, I couldn't throw the invitation away. Instead, I found myself staring at the address. It wasn't some sketchy club downtown. It was an upscale townhouse in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. This wasn't casual. This was deliberate. I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening on the card. Was I really considering this? Andrea had already made her choice. She had walked away. And yet, here she was, inviting me to step into her world, to see what she saw. I should have ignored it. Should have thrown the card into the trash, downed a few whiskeys, and forgotten it ever arrived. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. Because no matter how much I hated what she had done, no matter how much it gutted me, part of me still needed to understand. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to see for myself if there was anything left to salvage. The next night, I found myself standing outside the townhouse. It was nothing like I expected. No neon signs, no sleazy bouncers, no obvious signs of debauchery. Just a sleek, modern building with warm golden lights glowing behind tall windows. A doorman in a sharp black suit nodded as I approached. "Name?" he asked, polite but firm. "Rob," I said, clearing my throat. Andrea invited me. His eyes flickered with recognition. "Welcome," he said, stepping aside. The door swung open, and I stepped inside. Soft, ambient music hummed through the air. The scent of expensive perfume, candle wax, and something else, something intoxicating, curled around me. The lighting was low, intimate, casting deep shadows along the walls. People milled about, laughing, talking, sipping drinks in crystal glasses. Beautiful people, the kind of polished, confident men and women who looked like they belonged here. And then, as if sensing me, as if she knew I had come, Andrea appeared. She stepped from the shadows, wearing a deep red dress that clung to her in a way that made my throat dry. Her hair was swept up, exposing the curve of her neck, the line of her collarbone. She looked breathtaking. But it wasn't just her beauty. It was something else. A confidence, a glow, a way she carried herself that was both familiar and foreign. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled softly. "You came." "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. "I guess I did." Her eyes searched mine, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't sure who held the power anymore. "Come," she said, holding out a hand. "Let me show you." And against every instinct, every voice in my head screaming at me to turn around and walk away, I took it. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place where people came to disappear. A low hum of conversation filled the air, mixing with the occasional clink of glasses and the distant, melancholic wail of a blues guitar playing from the jukebox. It smelled of old leather, stale beer, and something else. Regret, maybe. I had been nursing a whiskey for the past hour, staring at the amber liquid as if it held the answers to the questions that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Andrea's voice still echoed in my head, that desperate, pleading tone when she asked me to understand. I thought we were strong enough for this. What a joke. I took another slow sip, letting the burn settle in my chest. The truth was, I didn't know if I was angry, hurt, or just numb. I had spent the past few weeks drifting between those emotions like a ship caught in a storm, never quite finding solid ground. Some days, I convinced myself I was fine, that I didn't need her, that I could walk away and never look back. But then, there were nights like this. Nights where her absence felt like a wound that wouldn't close. I ran a hand over my face, exhausted. "Another?" the bartender asked, nodding at my near-empty glass. I hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, why not?" As he poured, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A woman had just walked in, tall, confident, the kind of presence that turned heads without trying. She slid onto a bar stool a few seats away, ordering a drink in a voice smooth as silk. I hadn't been looking to talk to anyone, but something about her made it impossible to look away. I turned slightly, meeting her gaze. She smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "Rough night?" she asked. I let out a dry chuckle. "Something like that." She tilted her head, studying me. "You've got the look of a man who's either about to start a fight or fall apart." "Maybe both," I admitted, taking another sip. She smiled again, this time with something softer in her eyes. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't. Normally, I'd keep it all locked up, push it down where it couldn't reach me. But tonight, with whiskey warm in my veins and the weight of everything pressing down on me, I found myself saying, "My wife wants an open marriage." The woman blinked, then let out a surprised laugh. "Damn, didn't see that coming." "Yeah," I muttered, swirling my drink. "And you're not on board with that, I take it?" she asked. I scoffed. "What do you think?" She raised an eyebrow. "I think that depends. Some people make it work." I turned to her fully now, studying her. "You sound like you've done this before." She shrugged, taking a sip of her own drink. "Not exactly, but I've been the other person a couple of times." That caught me off guard. "So you go after married men?" "Not intentionally," she said with a smirk. "But life is messy. People get lonely. They get lost. and sometimes they find comfort in the wrong places. I stared at her for a long moment. And do they ever find what they're looking for? I asked. She exhaled slowly, her expression shifting, just for a second, to something almost sad. Sometimes, she said, but most of the time, no. I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The bar buzzed around us, voices rising and falling, glasses clinking, life moving on like it always did. So, what are you going to do? She asked eventually. I let out a breath. I don't know. It was the truth. I didn't know if I could forgive Andrea, if I even wanted to. All I knew was that something had broken between us, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be put back together. The night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and the distant hum of traffic. Streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the sidewalk as I walked toward the bar, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. My mind was a storm, filled with too many questions and not enough answers. It had been weeks since Andrea's proposal, weeks filled with silence, confusion, and the slow, gnawing ache of betrayal. I tried to move forward, to drown myself in work, in distractions, in anything that kept me from thinking about the woman I once thought I would spend forever with. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it haunted me. And now I was here. The bar was nothing special, dimly lit, half empty, the kind of place where people went to be alone even when surrounded by others. I had chosen it for that reason. I didn't want company. I just wanted a drink. Sliding onto a stool, I ordered a whiskey neat, nodding absently at the bartender as he poured. The burn of the alcohol was welcome, sharp and unforgiving, like a reminder that I was still here, still feeling. Didn't think I'd find you in a place like this. I turned at the sound of the voice, my heart tightening in my chest. Andrea. She stood just a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She looked different, tired maybe, or maybe I was just seeing her differently now. What do you want? I asked, my voice flat. She hesitated before stepping closer, slipping onto the stool beside me. To talk, she said simply. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Talk? About what? How your exploring is going? She flinched. Rob, no, really. I cut her off, turning to face her fully now. That's what you wanted, right? Freedom? Discovery? So tell me, what have you discovered? She stared at me for a long moment, her lips pressing together like she was trying to hold something back. Then finally she sighed. I made a mistake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze. Of all the things I expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. A mistake, I repeated, my throat tightening. She nodded. I thought I needed something else. I thought I needed to find myself, or whatever excuse I convinced myself of. But the truth is, I was running. Running from what? She exhaled, gripping the edge of the bar like she needed something solid to hold on to. From myself. From the fear that maybe I wasn't enough for you. That maybe I was the one holding us back. And instead of facing that, I sabotaged us. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Because part of me wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that this was just a momentary lapse, that she had been lost, and now she had found her way back. But the other part of me, the part that had spent weeks alone, questioning everything, wasn't sure if I could. You should have talked to me, I said finally, my voice quieter now. I know, she admitted, her eyes shining. And I regret it. Every single day. Silence stretched between us, heavy with everything unsaid. Then, she reached for my hand. For the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, the pavement still slick from the evening storm. Streetlights cast pale, yellow glows onto the wet asphalt, their reflections stretching and warping like ghosts. I stood outside our apartment building, the key in my hand feeling heavier than it should. Inside, Andrea was waiting. It had been weeks since the night at the restaurant. Weeks of silence, of unanswered texts, of distance growing like ivy between us. I had spent those nights walking the city, sleeping in a friend's guest room, trying to make sense of the wreckage she had left behind, trying to understand how the woman I had built my life with could suddenly be someone I didn't recognize. But tonight was different. Tonight, I had made my decision. I took a slow breath and pushed the key into the lock. The door swung open with a quiet creak, revealing the dimly lit apartment. The place smelled the same. Andrea's lavender candles, the faint traces of her perfume. But it didn't feel the same. She was sitting on the couch, curled up in one of my hoodies, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the coffee table beside her. She looked up the moment I walked in. "Rob." Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if I was real or just another ghost of the past few weeks. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, studying her. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded quickly, sitting up straighter. Yes, we do." For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then she spoke. She started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I made a mistake." I didn't respond. "I thought I needed this," she continued, her voice trembling. "I thought I needed to explore, to find something I thought was missing. But I was wrong. So wrong." She reached for my hand. I didn't move. "I don't want anyone else, Rob. I don't. I just want you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was selfish. I hurt you, and I hate myself for it." I let out a slow breath, my chest tightening. "So what changed?" I asked quietly. Andrea let out a broken laugh, wiping her eyes. "I did. I thought I'd feel free, like I was chasing some new version of myself. But instead, I just felt empty." She shook her head. "All I wanted was you, and I was terrified I had already lost you." She looked up at me, searching my face for something. "Can we fix this?" she whispered. The question lingered in the air between us. For so long, I had played every version of this moment in my head. I had imagined screaming at her, walking away without a word, begging her to explain herself. But now, standing in front of her, all I felt was tired. I loved her. God, I still loved her. But love wasn't the same as trust. And trust was already shattered. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice rough. Andrea's face crumpled. I took a slow step forward, then another, until I was standing in front of her. I reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek, my touch gentle but distant. "You're my home," I said, "my future. And now, I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." A sob broke from her lips. I swallowed hard. "I don't hate you, but I don't know if I can forgive you." Andrea nodded through her tears, understanding what I couldn't say out loud. "Then what happens now?" she whispered. I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them. "I think it's time I find my own path," I said, my voice steady now. Her breath hitched. "Rob, please." But I was already turning toward the door. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and glanced back at her one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Andrea." And then, without another word, I stepped out into the night, leaving behind the life I once thought was unshakable. Leaving behind the woman I once believed would never break my heart. Betrayed, broken, reborn. A man's ultimate revenge and redemption. The numbers on the screen blurred together, a sea of red drowning Michael's vision. He adjusted his glasses, blinking hard, but the reality didn't change. The bank account balance stared back at him, mocking him. The mortgage, the bills, the dwindling savings. It was all there, a slow-motion disaster, unfolding right in front of him. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had done everything right, or at least he thought he had. A stable career, a good salary, a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. 2 beautiful children. A wife he had loved, trusted, built a life with. And yet here he was, drowning. The clock on his desk read 9:47 p.m. when the front door lock clicked open. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He knew the sound of Jennifer's footsteps as she entered, knew the way she tossed her purse onto the console table. the way she kicked off her heels without bending down. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Instead, he listened. The rustle of her coat as she draped it over the chair. The faint sound of ice clinking as she poured herself a drink. The refrigerator door opening, then closing. Finally, her voice, flat, emotionless. Did the kids go to bed? Michael's fingers curled into a fist. The kids. Not our kids. Just the kids. They've been asleep for hours, he replied, his voice just as distant. Jennifer hummed a vague response, neither interested nor surprised. A few years ago, she would have rushed in to kiss them goodnight, whispering stories in the dark until they drifted off. Now, she barely remembered to ask. Michael turned in his chair, watching as she leaned against the kitchen counter, glass of whiskey in hand. She looked exhausted, but not in the way he was. Not the bone-deep, soul-draining exhaustion of a man fighting to keep everything together. Hers was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from keeping secrets. He had noticed it months ago, the way she avoided his gaze, the way she pulled away when he touched her. The late nights, the half-hearted excuses, the way she suddenly cared about the way she looked before leaving the house, even on days she claimed to be swamped at work. She was slipping away, piece by piece. And Michael had a sinking feeling that someone else was catching those pieces. Still, he had played along, pretending not to notice the perfume that wasn't his. The text messages she always cleared. The extra care she put into her appearance before company dinners. Maybe he had been waiting for her to say it. Maybe he had hoped she wouldn't. But when she finally spoke, it still hit him like a gunshot to the chest. Michael, I want a divorce. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in. Michael stared at her, not sure what he expected to see in her face. Regret? Pain? Anything? But no, just cold indifference. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He simply let the words settle, absorbing them, turning them over in his mind. 17 years of marriage, reduced to 5 words. Jennifer sighed, setting her glass down. I didn't want to do this like this, but Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. Spare me. She blinked, not in guilt, not in remorse, in mild surprise, as if she expected him to beg, to fall apart, to demand answers. But Michael didn't. Instead, he felt something else, something unexpected. Relief. A bitter, almost laughable relief. He had been bracing for this moment for months, maybe even years, and now that it was finally here, the weight in his chest didn't feel as heavy as he thought it would. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. We can figure things out amicably, she said, as if she were discussing the logistics of returning a defective appliance. For the kids. For both of us. Michael studied her, really studied her. The woman he had once adored, once trusted with everything. The woman who used to be his home. But now she was just another person in the room. He nodded slowly. Fine. Jennifer blinked again. This time, she wasn't surprised. She was thrown off. She had been expecting resistance. A fight. Tears. Anything but acceptance. But Michael was done fighting for someone who had stopped fighting for him a long time ago. He turned back to his computer, fingers resting on the keyboard. The numbers on the screen hadn't changed. The debt was still there. The mess of his life still loomed over him. But suddenly, he wasn't afraid anymore. Because for the first time in years, Michael knew exactly what he had to do. Michael hadn't always been this hollow version of himself. There was a time when he had dreams, ambitions, when he had control. Once, he had been a man of purpose, a brilliant programmer, climbing the corporate ladder with steady hands and a sharp mind. He had built systems, solved impossible problems, and earned the respect of his peers. He had provided for his family, given Jennifer a beautiful home, and ensured their children had every opportunity to thrive. But success is a fragile thing. It can vanish as quickly as it comes. The layoff had been a slow death. He saw the signs months before it happened. The canceled meetings, the distant looks from upper management, the whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered the room. He knew the company was shifting, tightening its belt, looking for places to cut costs. And then, one ordinary Wednesday afternoon, his name had been called. "We appreciate everything you've done for the company, Michael." A handshake, a severance package, a polite but firm escort out the door. And just like that, 17 years of work, his identity was gone. He had driven home in a daze, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced with solutions. He would find another job. He would bounce back. He had to. But when he walked through the front door, Jennifer barely looked up from her phone. "I lost my job," he had said, his voice hoarse. She blinked, as if he had told her the weather report. "That sucks," she said flatly. Then, after a pause, "What are you going to do?" What was he going to do? He had expected concern, comfort, maybe even anger on his behalf. But there was nothing. No warmth, no reassurance, no embrace. Just a cold detachment that chilled him to the bone. In the weeks that followed, Michael spiraled. He sent out resumes, networked with old colleagues, and scoured job boards late into the night. But the job market was brutal. He was in his 40s now, competing with younger, cheaper talent. The rejection emails piled up. The interviews, when he got them, led nowhere. Meanwhile, Jennifer flourished. She had started her marketing job as a part-time gig, something to keep herself busy. But after Michael's layoff, she began working longer hours, spending more and more time at the office. The distance between them widened. At first, Michael assumed she was just picking up the slack, that she was stepping in to help. But something felt off. She no longer asked how his day was. She no longer touched him at night. When he reached for her, she flinched, as if his hands were foreign. The late nights became more frequent, the excuses more rehearsed. Then came the moment that shattered his delusions. It was his birthday. He hadn't expected much, a quiet dinner, a cake, maybe a small gift. Jennifer had been distant lately, but surely she would make an effort. But as the evening wore on, it became clear she had no plans. She handed him a generic sweater, still in the store bag, and muttered, "Happy birthday." That was it. He forced a smile, nodding, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending he didn't notice the absence of love in her voice. Later that night, he went to the closet to put the sweater away. That's when he saw it. A small, elegant pink gift box, neatly wrapped, hidden beneath her clothes. His heart leapt. Maybe she does care. Maybe she was saving something special for later. He reached for it, hands trembling with anticipation. And then he saw the note. "To my beloved one." Not to Michael, not to my husband. Just beloved one. His stomach twisted into a knot so tight he could barely breathe. He stood there, frozen, staring at those 3 words, feeling the weight of 17 years collapse around him. The next morning, there was no second gift, no surprise. Jennifer kissed his cheek absent-mindedly before heading to work, leaving him alone in a house that suddenly felt like a stranger's. That was the moment Michael knew. Jennifer was having an affair. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, gripping the closet door, his vision blurred with the crushing realization. But one thing was certain. The life he had built, the marriage he had fought for, was over. Michael sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, the room around him heavy with silence. A spreadsheet flickered on his screen, filled with meaningless numbers he couldn't bring himself to care about. His mind wasn't on work, nor on the bills piling up on the counter. It was somewhere darker, somewhere bitter and sharp-edged. He drummed his fingers against the desk, staring at the whiskey glass beside him, half empty. His jaw tightened. Jennifer was hiding something. At first, he had dismissed his suspicions as paranoia, just the anxious byproducts of a crumbling marriage. But the signs were undeniable now. The way she avoided his gaze, the way she seemed permanently glued to her phone, smiling at messages she never shared, the scent of cologne that wasn't his, the subtle, almost imperceptible way she pulled away when he reached for her. And then there was the gift. It had been a stupid mistake on her part, really, leaving it there, tucked inside the closet behind a row of winter coats. Michael had found it accidentally, while searching for an old sweater. A sleek black box wrapped in soft pink ribbon. His heart had pounded in his chest as he picked it up, turning it over in his hands. He had never been the type to pry, to dig through his wife's things like some insecure teenager. But this wasn't prying, this was confirmation. Slowly, methodically, he pulled the ribbon loose and opened the box. Inside, nestled in delicate tissue paper, was a set of lacy, expensive lingerie, the kind Jennifer hadn't worn for him in years. Alongside, it was a handwritten note on elegant cardstock. "For my beloved one, can't wait to see you in this." There was no name, no signature, but Michael didn't need one. A cold wave of nausea crashed over him. He sat there for a long time, staring at the box, feeling his body go numb. Maybe she had bought it for herself. He tried to reason. Maybe it was for him. Maybe there was a logical explanation. But deep down, in that raw, brutal place of truth, he knew. It wasn't for him. That realization felt like a knife twisting inside him. He replaced the lid carefully, as if handling something fragile, something that could cut him if he wasn't careful. He rewrapped the ribbon with steady hands, slid the box back into its hiding place, and stood there in the darkened bedroom, breathing heavily. Everything after that became a blur. Michael's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the upscale restaurant from across the street. His car sat in the shadows, engine off, the world outside moving in slow motion. Jennifer had left earlier that evening, dressed in a sleek black dress he hadn't seen before. "It's Alan's birthday," she had said casually, swiping on lipstick in the mirror. "I'll be home late." Alan Henderson. Michael had met him once. A young, arrogant executive at Jennifer's marketing firm. He had shaken Michael's hand with a firm grip, given him a confident, almost too confident smile. He was everything Michael wasn't: charming, ambitious, thriving. And Jennifer had laughed at his jokes. That alone had been enough to plant the first seed of doubt. Now, watching the restaurant, Michael felt the doubt crystallize into certainty. Through the wide glass windows, he could see the guests milling about, clinking wine glasses, laughing in warm candlelight. And then there she was, Jennifer. His stomach clenched. She stood close to Alan, leaning in slightly, her expression soft in a way Michael hadn't seen in years. Alan placed a hand on the small of her back as he whispered something in her ear. She laughed, tilting her head, touching his arm. A casual observer might see two colleagues enjoying themselves at a party. Michael saw everything. His hands trembled, not with rage, but with something colder, something deeper. He wasn't a fool anymore. He had been watching. For weeks, he had noted the late nights, the secretive smiles, the way she had started wearing perfume again, the growing distance between them, like a canyon widening, threatening to collapse entirely. And now, he had his answer. The box was gone. Michael had checked before leaving the house. The pink ribbon, the sleek black box, it had disappeared. Jennifer had given it to him. Michael exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. There was no confrontation to be had tonight. No dramatic outburst. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Michael didn't remember driving home. He only remembered the crushing weight in his chest, the realization that 17 years of marriage had been built on a foundation that was already cracked beyond repair. He poured himself a drink the moment he walked through the door, gulping it down without even tasting it. The alcohol burned, but it wasn't enough to numb the storm inside him. The sound of the front door unlocking sent a jolt through his system. Jennifer walked in, heels clicking against the floor, the scent of wine and perfume trailing after her. She looked surprised to see him still awake. "You're up late," she remarked, slipping off her coat. Her tone was casual, too casual. Michael set his glass down carefully. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." She nodded, not really paying attention. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at it briefly before tucking it away. Michael watched her closely. He could have confronted her right then. Shouted, accused, demanded answers. But what was the point? She would deny it. She would call him crazy, gaslight him, make him feel like he was the one breaking their marriage apart. No, that wasn't how this would go. Jennifer disappeared into the bathroom, and Michael sat there, silent, fingers tapping against the armrest. A slow, knowing smirk curled on his lips. He wouldn't break. She would. And when she did, he would be ready. Michael sat in the dimly lit corner of a downtown cafe, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. The bitterness burned his tongue, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, calculating, strategizing. His whole life had been about numbers, patterns, and logic, and now, for the first time in years, he felt the thrill of a challenge. The lawyer had been blunt. Without solid proof of infidelity, you'll be looking at an equal split, assets, savings, maybe even alimony. And depending on how things go, custody of the kids could be contested. Michael had sat there, swallowing his anger, his fingers pressing into the leather armrest of the chair. He had expected some unfairness, but hearing it laid out in clinical terms made it all the more infuriating. Jennifer could walk away with half of everything he had built after destroying their marriage, after throwing him aside like an old appliance. But what if there was nothing left to take? The thought had struck him like lightning, igniting something cold and calculating deep within him. Jennifer wanted a fresh start? Fine, but she wouldn't get it at his expense. And so, Michael began his game. The first step was simple: make the money disappear. Not overnight, of course. That would be too obvious. Instead, it had to be slow, methodical, just enough to go unnoticed until it was too late. His first major move was securing the kids' future. He met with a financial advisor, carefully shifting a large portion of their savings into education accounts that Jennifer couldn't legally access. No judge would ever question a father ensuring his children's future. Next, he made questionable investments. A new luxury SUV. On paper, a foolish purchase for a man in his situation. But in reality, it was fully paid off, an asset he could sell later if needed. Then came the smaller withdrawals. Every few days, a little at a time, he pulled cash from their accounts, stashing it in a fireproof safe hidden in the garage. He could almost hear Jennifer's complaints in his head. Michael, we need to be more responsible with money. Michael, you need to find another job. Oh, how she would scream when she realized the money was gone. Money was one thing. Proof was another. Michael needed to confirm his suspicions, to gather irrefutable evidence of Jennifer's betrayal. He hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, like something out of a crime novel, but it was necessary. The PI was a no-nonsense man in his 50s, a former detective who had seen it all. He took the case without judgment, his eyes sharp and calculating. Standard package, the man had said, sliding a contract across the table. Surveillance, photography, phone logs if needed. You'll know everything. Michael signed without hesitation. The wait was excruciating. Days passed in agonizing silence. Jennifer remained her usual self, distant, cold, disinterested. But now, Michael saw her in a different light. Every late night, every unexplained meeting, every secretive text message, it was all so obvious. How had he not seen it before? Then, one evening, an email arrived. Subject: surveillance report. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he clicked on the attachment. And there it was. Photos, text logs, hotel reservations. Jennifer and Alan, together, intimate, smiling. Proof. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the images, his emotions strangely muted. The rage he had expected to feel never came. Instead, there was only a cold, quiet certainty. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about winning. Michael needed to time everything perfectly. The financial drain had to be nearly complete before Jennifer filed for divorce, or before he confronted her. If she caught wind of his actions too soon, she could retaliate, maybe even accuse him of hiding assets. So, he played the part. He acted oblivious, going through the motions of their failing marriage, pretending not to notice her absences. He feigned exhaustion when she made passive-aggressive comments about him not contributing enough. Every now and then, he'd casually mention job interviews that didn't exist, leaving her with the impression that he was struggling. Let her believe she had the upper hand. Meanwhile, he made sure to be the perfect father, attending every soccer game, every school meeting, strengthening his bond with the kids. If Jennifer wanted to fight for custody, she'd have to go through hell to take them from him. And just to add a little more insurance, he met with a forensic accountant, just in case he needed to prove where every dollar had gone. Jennifer had no idea what was coming. Michael stood in front of the mirror one night, studying himself. For months, he had felt like a victim of his circumstances, of Jennifer's betrayal, of his own inaction. But now, he saw something else in his reflection. Control. Power. A man who wasn't about to let his life be destroyed. Jennifer wanted out? She would get it, but she would leave with nothing. Michael smiled to himself, a slow, calculated smirk. The game was on. Michael sat alone in the dim light of his office. The only sound in the room, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. A thick folder lay open on the desk in front of him, filled with photographs, receipts, and phone records. Proof. Cold, undeniable proof. His fingers traced the edge of a glossy photo, a candid shot of Jennifer and Alan in a parking garage. The way they stood close, her hand resting lightly on his chest. The way she looked up at him with a softness she hadn't shown Michael in years. He should have been furious. He should have wanted to throw the folder across the room, to scream, to break something. But all he felt was emptiness, a vast, hollow space where his love for Jennifer used to be. Michael reached for the tumbler of whiskey beside him and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He flipped through the evidence methodically, as if analyzing lines of code in a broken program. Each page added another nail to the coffin of their marriage. Hotel receipts, weekly rendezvous at the Rosewood Suites, call logs, late-night conversations, always when he was asleep, restaurant bills, expensive dinners paid for with a joint account. Their money. The betrayal was so calculated, so effortless. Had she ever hesitated? Had she ever felt guilt? Or had she convinced herself that Michael was the villain, that she deserved this? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The man he had been a year ago would have crumbled under this truth. But that man no longer existed. In his place stood someone colder, sharper, more precise. This wasn't about revenge. This was about control. And Jennifer had no idea she had already lost. He had learned to wear a mask. At breakfast the next morning, he watched Jennifer move around the kitchen, sipping her coffee as if she hadn't just spent the night in another man's arms. She was an actress in her own carefully crafted illusion, a woman who had convinced herself that she was still in control. Michael played his part well. He asked about her work, nodded at her excuses, even smiled at the appropriate moments. The act was almost effortless. But then Jennifer said something that made his grip tighten around his coffee mug. "You don't look well, Michael," she said, tilting her head. There was something in her tone, almost amused, as if she could sense his unraveling, as if she enjoyed it. He met her gaze, holding it a fraction too long. The urge to tell her everything, to shove the folder in her face and watch her world collapse, was overwhelming. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled. "No, darling," he said smoothly. "Nothing at all." And for the first time, Jennifer hesitated. Over the next few weeks, the noose tightened around Jennifer's neck. She just didn't know it yet. Michael drained the accounts with careful precision, ensuring there was nothing left for her to claim when she finally made her move. He met with the best divorce lawyer in the city, not to fight, but to outmaneuver. There would be no dramatic courtroom battle, no drawn-out legal war. Jennifer would walk into their divorce expecting to win. She would leave with nothing. And then, the final stroke. Michael had been patient, but now it was time to tip the first domino. One simple email, sent from an anonymous account. One carefully chosen recipient, Melissa Henderson. Alan's wife. The subject line was simple: "You deserve to know the truth." The attached photos would do the rest. Michael had spent months carefully dismantling the life he and Jennifer had built together, piece by piece, ensuring that when the final hammer fell, it would land squarely on her. Now, standing in the middle of their once shared home, he could feel the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The walls still held memories, pictures of their wedding, of vacations taken in happier times, of birthdays where laughter had echoed through these rooms. But Michael felt nothing for them anymore. That life was dead. Jennifer, however, had no idea just how dead it was. She stood across from him in the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expensive gold bracelet catching the dim kitchen light. The same bracelet Michael had once gifted her, when he had still been the devoted husband, the provider, the fool. Now, she was looking at him with barely concealed disdain, as if she had already won. "I've spoken to my lawyer," she said, her voice cool and confident. "We're going to finalize everything by next month. The sooner we end this, the better." Michael didn't respond immediately. He sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch until Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. "You're awfully sure of yourself," he said finally, setting his mug down. Jennifer rolled her eyes. "Michael, let's not drag this out. We both know how this is going to end. You don't have a job. I do. The court will see that I'm a stable parent. And financially, I'll get what I'm entitled to. Half of everything." She smiled, tilting her head slightly, as if she were bestowing mercy upon him. Michael smiled back, a slow, deliberate smile. She had no idea. 3 days later, the call came. Michael was at a cafe, sipping his morning espresso, when Jennifer's number flashed on his screen. He let it ring out. Then another call, and another. He finally answered on the fourth. "What?" The sound of raw panic filled the line. "Where's the money, Michael?" she demanded. Michael took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. "What money?" "The accounts. Our savings. The investments. They're gone. What the hell did you do?" Jennifer's voice cracked, and for the first time in years, Michael heard real fear in it. Not annoyance, not exasperation. Fear. He closed his eyes, breathing in the satisfaction. "I had expenses," he said finally. "We had expenses." "Bullshit. You spent everything." Michael shrugged, though she couldn't see it. "Well, I lost my job. Times got tough." A heavy silence. Then, more carefully, "Are you telling me there's nothing left?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "Not for you, no." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. He could picture her now, pacing the floor, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You did this on purpose." Michael chuckled. "Prove it." She let out a strangled curse before the call disconnected. He set his phone down, feeling lighter than he had in years. Jennifer thought she had lost everything. She was wrong. The worst was yet to come. 2 weeks later, the affair became public knowledge. Michael had insured it. The private investigator's folder, filled with photos, receipts, and text logs, found its way into Alan Henderson's wife's hands. And when a scorned wife learns her husband has been screwing his employee behind her back, well, hell hath no fury. Within days, Alan's wife had filed for divorce, demanding half of his assets. Word spread like wildfire. Alan, facing a scandal he couldn't contain, was placed on an immediate leave of absence. Jennifer, by extension, became a liability. And then came the final twist of fate. She was fired. Not officially for the affair, of course. The company cited corporate restructuring. But everyone knew the truth. The whispers in the office halls, the avoidance of eye contact, the way her colleagues suddenly treated her like a leper. Michael received another call that night. Jennifer didn't scream this time. She was crying. "I lost my job," she whispered, her voice small. "Alan's divorcing his wife. She's taking everything. And now I have nothing." Michael listened, waiting. She hesitated, then broke down completely. "Michael, I made a mistake." He let that sink in. For years, he had imagined this moment. The moment she would realize what she had done, the moment she would come crawling back, desperate and broken. And yet, now that it was here, he felt nothing. Jennifer wasn't his problem anymore. Michael let out a slow breath. Yes, you did. Silence. Then, a shaky, can we talk? Michael smiled to himself. No, Jennifer, he said calmly. We can't. And with that, he hung up. Outside, the city lights burned bright, promising a new beginning. And for the first time in years, Michael walked forward without looking back. The sky was a soft shade of amber as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Michael's new home, a modest but elegant house in a quiet neighborhood. The laughter of his children echoed from the backyard, a sound that had become more frequent since the divorce was finalized. It was a sound he had once feared he might never hear again. Michael sat on the porch, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hands. He had grown to enjoy these quiet moments, the simple pleasure of a peaceful evening without the suffocating tension that had filled his old life. He was no longer a man shackled by betrayal, no longer drowning in bitterness. He had rebuilt himself, piece by piece. Then his phone rang. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen. The name flashing on it was one he hadn't seen in months. Jennifer. He let the phone ring a few more times before answering, his voice calm and measured. Hello. There was silence on the other end, long enough that he might have thought she'd changed her mind. But then she spoke. Michael. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Can we talk? Michael took a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. He could hear something in her voice, something he hadn't heard in years. Defeat. Once, he would have longed for this moment, for Jennifer to realize what she had lost, to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness. But now it felt meaningless. What do you want, Jennifer? He asked, taking a sip of his coffee. A shaky breath. Then, she admitted, I made a mistake. Michael closed his eyes. He could picture her sitting in some dimly lit apartment, alone, the weight of her choices finally sinking in. The glamorous life she had imagined for herself had collapsed. Alan had discarded her like an old business card. The financial security she assumed would follow the divorce had never come. Her friends had moved on, leaving her stranded in the wreckage she had created. But Michael? He had survived. He had won. Is that so? He said, his tone neutral. I was stupid, she continued, her voice cracking. I thought. She stopped herself. I don't know what I thought. Michael could hear the raw regret in her voice. But regret wasn't the same as love. It wasn't the same as redemption. It was simply the realization that she had lost. There's nothing left for us to say, Jennifer, Michael said finally. But the kids, they're happy. They're safe. He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. And they don't ask about you anymore. The silence that followed was heavier than words. Michael stood up, stepping onto the grass, feeling the cool earth beneath his feet. He had spent too much time walking through the fire of betrayal, but now he was free. With one final glance at the darkening sky, he pressed end call and walked toward his children's laughter, toward his future, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Behind him, starting over, a story of love, betrayal, and new beginnings. The world was still asleep when I stepped into the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a low and steady whisper in the silence. I liked it this way, before the sun stretched over the horizon, before the girls woke up, before Katie came downstairs in a rush, always running late. I pulled a mug from the cabinet, the same dark blue one I used every morning, and poured my coffee. Black. No sugar, no cream. Just the bitter warmth spreading through my hands as I took my first sip. It was my ritual, my moment of stillness. Outside, the early light painted the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. I stepped onto the back porch, inhaling the crisp morning air, listening to the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The wooden deck was cool beneath my bare feet, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the coffee in my hands. I should have felt content. I had everything a man could ask for: a beautiful home, a stable job, two wonderful daughters, and a wife I had loved since we were just kids stumbling through life together. And yet, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way Katie had been acting lately. She used to be the first one to wish me a good morning, wrapping her arms around me from behind, pressing a sleepy kiss to my shoulder. Lately, she barely looked at me. Her mornings were rushed, her conversations clipped. Some days, she didn't speak to me at all before heading out the door. I told myself it was nothing. People changed. Life got in the way. She was stressed, working more hours than usual. But there were other things, too. Small things that wouldn't mean anything on their own. But together, they formed an uneasy pattern. The way she had started dressing differently, more makeup, tighter clothes, heels she never used to wear. The way she kept her phone glued to her side, silencing notifications when I walked into the room. The way she laughed a little too hard at messages I never saw. I took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. I was overthinking. I had to be. The sound of footsteps inside broke my thoughts. A moment later, the door slid open, and Jill stepped onto the porch, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, offering her a small smile. She yawned. "Why are you up so early?" I chuckled. "Why are you up so early?" Jill shrugged, sitting on the chair beside me. Couldn't sleep. She was only 16, but already had the weight of the world on her shoulders. She reminded me so much of Katie when we first met, smart, driven, always thinking 5 steps ahead. "You okay?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." I knew better than to push. She'd come to me when she was ready. We sat there in silence for a while, watching the sky shift colors. Moments like this made life feel simple, even when it wasn't. Eventually, Jill stretched and stood. "I should probably get ready. Mom said we're going out today." I frowned. "Out where?" She blinked. "The beach." I paused. "The beach." She nodded. "Yeah, Mom's been planning it all week." A tightness formed in my chest. Katie had been planning a trip to the beach with the girls, and she hadn't mentioned it to me once. I forced a smile. "Sound fun?" Jill grinned. "It will be. You should come." Before I could answer, the sound of Katie's voice drifted through the open door. "Jill, come help your sister pack." Jill shot me an apologetic look. "Gotta go." I watched as she disappeared inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A family trip, on Father's Day, without me. I clenched my jaw, staring into my coffee. Something was wrong, and deep down, I already knew the answer. The morning air smelled of fresh dew and warm asphalt. I liked mornings, before the world stirred, before the weight of the day pressed against my chest. I stood on the back porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun stretch its golden arms over the rooftops. It was my birthday. It was also Father's Day. Katie should have been up by now. The girls, too. For as long as I could remember, our little tradition had been the same: pancakes and bacon, a handmade card, and sleepy hugs. Nothing grand, but it meant the world to me. But today, the house was quiet. The silence gnawed at me as I stepped back inside. The kitchen was empty, no smell of sizzling bacon, no laughter, no little hands shoving a crayon-covered card into mine. I checked my phone. No texts, no missed calls. A strange sensation curled in my gut. I wandered into the bedroom. Katie lay there, curled beneath the covers, her breathing deep and even. I said softly, nudging her shoulder. She groaned, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. I hesitated. "It's morning." She opened one eye, blinked at me, then sighed. What time is it?" "Almost 8." She yawned, stretching. Okay. I need to get the girls ready." Something was off. She wasn't groggy in the way she used to be after a restless night. She was sluggish, like someone trying to shake off deep exhaustion. I frowned. "Katie, do you know what today is?" She blinked. For a split second, I saw it: confusion, then realization, then something else: guilt. She sat up, raking her fingers through her hair. Oh, Bill, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. She forgot. It was like a punch to the gut. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, no big deal. Her face softened. We'll celebrate later, okay? It's just the girls and I had plans today. Plans? I repeated. She hesitated. We were going to the beach. I frowned. Without me. Katie bit her lip. It was kind of last minute. Jill really wanted to go, and I figured. Are you serious? I said, laughing, but there was no humor in it. You taking the girls out on Father's Day? On my birthday? Her face twisted, like she was trying to find the right words. Bill, we can do something when I get back, she said. It's not like I planned it to be on your birthday, but it is on my birthday. She exhaled sharply. I'm sorry, okay? It's just been so hectic lately. Work, the girls, everything. I didn't think. No, I said, shaking my head. You did think. You just didn't think about me. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but she smothered it quickly. Bill, please, don't make this a big deal. I studied her. She wasn't even trying to fix it. Not really. She was just waiting for me to drop it, to say it was fine, to let her go. Right, I said stiffly. Go ahead. Have fun. Her shoulders relaxed. I'll make it up to you. I said nothing. A few minutes later, the girls came bounding down the stairs, beach bags slung over their shoulders. Bye, Dad, Jenny called out. I forced a smile. Bye, sweetheart. Jill hesitated by the door. You sure you don't want to come? Before I could answer, Katie put a hand on her shoulder. Dad's busy today, honey. Busy. I watched as they walked out the door, laughing, the sound of their joy disappearing into the summer air. I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down at the kitchen table. Alone. I left the house with no particular destination in mind. The silence inside those walls had become unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint ticking of the clock only reminded me that I was alone, forgotten on a day that once meant something. I ended up in IHOP out of habit. It had been our go-to breakfast spot when the girls were little. I stepped inside, only to be met with a scene I wasn't prepared for. Fathers surrounded by their families, balloons tied to chairs, handmade cards propped up against plates of pancakes, laughter. A waitress walked past me with a tray of food. I caught a glimpse of a small boy sitting in a booth, beaming as he handed his father a crayon-scrawled card. The man ruffled the boy's hair, his eyes filled with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Love. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Without saying a word, I turned and walked out. The moment I hit the parking lot, I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the bitterness crawling up my throat. I ended up at McDonald's instead. It felt fitting, cheap, quick, impersonal. I ordered a breakfast sandwich and a black coffee, then drove to the park. The morning air was warm, the sky an endless blue stretching above the treetops. I sat on a bench, unwrapped my sandwich, and took a bite. It tasted like cardboard. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping, foolishly, that it was Katie. It wasn't. A Facebook notification. I clicked on it without thinking. There she was, Katie, smiling, carefree. The girls on either side of her, their arms wrapped around her waist, the ocean stretching behind them like a perfect backdrop. A perfect day with my favorite people. My stomach dropped. My favorite people. The words twisted inside me, sharp and cruel. I stared at the screen, the picture burning into my mind. Where was I in this equation? I had been erased. I set my phone down beside me, my appetite gone. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, whispering something I wasn't ready to hear. You don't belong in her world anymore. I clenched my jaw. No, I was overreacting. It was just a caption, just a photo. She had simply forgotten to mention me. But then I thought about the past few months. The late nights, the new clothes, the way she had started turning away from me in bed, her body stiff and distant. The weight of it all pressed down on me like a boulder. I didn't want to believe it. But the truth doesn't need your permission to exist. My phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it instinctively, grateful for the distraction. It was my assistant from the store. I hesitated before answering. Hey, Ann. Bill, I'm so sorry to bother you, but something happened at the store. I frowned. What's going on? It's Missy, she said, her voice tight. There was an incident. Some guy pushed her down the stairs. My grip on the phone tightened. What? Is she okay? She might have broken her arm, and said. She's at the hospital now. Did someone call the police? They're handling it, she assured me. I just wanted to keep you in the loop. I exhaled, rubbing my temple. Thanks, Ann. Keep me posted. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Missy, one of my best employees, kind-hearted, hardworking, who would push her down the stairs. And why? And why, on this day of all days, did I feel like my entire world was beginning to crumble? I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over Katie's name in my contacts. I wanted to call her, to hear her voice, to ask her if she had really forgotten my birthday, or if this distance between us was something deeper. But then I looked at that photo again, at the way she smiled, at the way she glowed, at the way she didn't even seem to remember I existed. I put my phone back down, and for the first time, I let myself wonder, what if I'd already lost her? The smell of charred steak and whiskey filled the dimly lit steakhouse. The place was busy but not overwhelming. Low conversations, the clinking of silverware, the occasional burst of laughter. I sat at the bar, nursing an old-fashioned, ice swirling in the amber liquid. It wasn't where I thought I'd be spending my birthday. But here I was, alone, on Father's Day, my mind circling like a vulture around a truth I wasn't ready to face. Rough night, a voice asked beside me. I turned to see an older man, maybe mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, the kind of face that had seen too much life. He sipped his beer with the ease of someone who had been through hell and made peace with it. Something like that, I muttered. Name's Lance, he said, extending his hand. I shook it. Bill. His friend, Jerry, a stockier guy with a thick mustache, gave me a nod. You look like you got a story to tell. I let out a dry chuckle. Not when I feel like telling. Lance smirked. That bad, huh? I stared at my drink, debating. Then, before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. My wife, she's been different lately. I swirled the glass in my hands, watching the ice spin, staying out late, dressing up when she never used to, acting distant. Jerry whistled low. That's never good. She took my daughters to the beach today, on my birthday, left me home alone. Lance frowned. That's messed up. I let out a hollow laugh. Yeah. There was a pause, the hum of the bar filling the space between us. Then Lance spoke, his voice steady but firm. She's cheating. The words cut through me like a blade. I blinked. Excuse me? She's pulling away, he said, looking me dead in the eye. Same thing happened to me. My wife started dressing up, working late, making excuses. Next thing I knew, she was sleeping with a guy from her office. Jerry nodded. Mine too. She suddenly had girls' nights every weekend. Turned out she wasn't with the girls at all. I shook my head. No, Katie wouldn't do that. Lance took a slow sip of his beer. You sure? I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. Was I sure? The late nights, the coldness, the way she'd pull away when I reached for her. Then there was Friday. I thought back to that night. How I called her, how she said she was out with the girls. But Jill had seen her, with a man. I gripped the edge of the bar. My stomach felt hollow, like the floor had just vanished beneath me. Lance leaned in slightly. Look, man, I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but if you got a gut feeling, don't ignore it. Find out the truth. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. The truth. That's what I needed. I tossed some cash on the bar, nodding at Lance and Jerry. Thanks. Good luck, Jerry said, his voice carrying a weight of experience. I stepped out into the night air, my heart pounding. The steakhouse was on the main strip of town, a place where the neon lights of bars and restaurants painted the sidewalk in blues and reds. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. I could call her, ask her directly, but she'd lie. If she had already done it once, she'd do it again. No, I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to start. I got in my truck and drove home, my fingers gripping the wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. When I stepped inside, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp. The girls were already asleep. Katie sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when she saw me. "You're home late," she said, her voice neutral. I stood there, staring at her. Her hair was damp from a shower, her face free of makeup. She looked normal, like the woman I had loved for years. But something was missing. The warmth, the familiarity, the spark. She wasn't the same. She shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. "What?" I took a deep breath. "What's his name?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Her face went blank. A slow blink. A sharp inhale. "What?" she whispered. I took a step forward. "The man you were with on Friday. The one Jill saw. What's his name?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. That silence told me everything. I felt something inside me crack. Something deep. Something fundamental. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. I nodded slowly, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. And just like that, everything we had built came crashing down. I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. For a second, I forgot. Forgot about the fight. Forgot about the truth that had shattered everything. Forgot about the weight in my chest. Then I turned my head and saw the empty side of the bed. Reality came rushing back like a freight train. Katie was still here. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards, the sound of water running in the bathroom. She hadn't left, but something had changed. We had crossed a threshold we couldn't return from. I swung my legs over the side of the couch, my back stiff from a night spent on the unforgiving cushions. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet for a home that had once been filled with love, laughter, and the innocent chaos of family life. The smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, and for a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, she would try to fix this. Then I saw her. Katie sat at the dining table, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee. She wasn't dressed for work. She wasn't wearing makeup. The confidence, the energy, the spark that had once defined her, it was all gone. She looked up when she noticed me, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something else. Guilt. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I didn't speak. I want to see if she would. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers curled around the coffee mug, knuckles turning white. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. I exhaled sharply through my nose, pushing away the anger boiling just beneath my skin. "You what?" She flinched, then slowly set the mug down. I don't know what to say. I laughed, but it was hollow, humorless. That's a first. Silence stretched between us like a chasm, wide and unbridgeable. Katie's lips trembled. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I let out a bitter chuckle. "Yeah? What was it supposed to be like, Katie? Were you planning to keep lying? Keep sneaking around? Keep pretending?" She looked away, shame etched into every line of her face. I took a step closer, the weight of the conversation pressing against my ribs. "How long?" Her breath hitched. "How long?" I repeated, my voice sharp as a blade. Tears pooled in her eyes. "6 months." A sharp, cruel laugh tore from my throat. Jesus Christ. 6 months. 6 months of coming home to her, of kissing her goodnight, of holding her in my arms, believing we were still us. 6 months of her looking me in the eye and lying. The betrayal settled deep in my bones, heavier than anything I had ever carried. She wiped at her face, her hands shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." I clenched my jaw so tightly it ached. "Well, congratulations, Katie. You did." Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I wanted to comfort her. "Habit, I guess. 15 years together will do that to you." But I didn't move. Because this time, She wasn't the one who needed comforting. I was. A soft sound caught my attention. I turned. Jill stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide, her face pale. My stomach twisted. She had heard. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to be steady. Jill. She blinked rapidly, her hands gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Is it true? Her voice was small, fragile, like a little girl's. Katie let out a soft, broken sob. Jill's gaze snapped to her mother, and for the first time in her life, I saw something in her eyes that I never thought I'd see. Disgust. Katie reached for her, but Jill took a step back. Don't, she whispered. Katie recoiled like she had been struck. Jill turned to me, her expression desperate. Dad, please tell me it's not true. I looked at her, really looked at her, the girl who had once fallen asleep on my chest as a baby, who had held my hand when she was scared, who had always seen her mother as a hero. And I couldn't lie to her. I nodded. Jill's breath hitched. She turned and ran down the hall, slamming her bedroom door behind her. Katie buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I didn't want this, she whispered. I stared at her, at the woman I had once thought I would grow old with, and felt nothing but emptiness. I hope he was worth it, I said, my voice hollow. Then I turned and walked away. And for the first time in our marriage, I didn't look back. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Even with the girls still living here, even with the familiar sounds of life humming in the background, the dishwasher running, the distant murmur of the television, there was an emptiness that settled into the walls, something cold and irreversible. Katie had moved into the guest room after I confronted her. That first night, she sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a blanket like it was armor, staring at me with red-rimmed eyes. Bill, No, my voice was calm, steady. Not because I wasn't angry. But because I was exhausted. She flinched like I had struck her. Just let me explain. I laughed bitterly. What is there to explain, Katie? You slept with someone else. Was it just once? Twice? Does it even matter? Her bottom lip trembled. It wasn't like that. I tilted my head. Oh, then what was it like? She opened her mouth, then closed it, shaking her head. That was when I knew. Whatever she was about to say, whatever justification, excuse, or apology she had rehearsed, didn't matter. It wouldn't change the fact that she had made a choice to betray everything we had built. I left her sitting there, staring at the wall. Jill and Jenny knew something was wrong. Kids always do. At first, they tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Jill filled the silence with stories about school, about her friends, about her plans for the summer. Jenny clung to me more than usual, curling up next to me while we watched TV, her little fingers latching onto my sleeve like she was afraid I would disappear. But the tension in the house was suffocating. 3 days after the confrontation, Jill cornered me in the kitchen. Is Mom leaving? She asked, her voice small but direct. I set down the coffee mug I had been holding. We're figuring things out. She folded her arms. You're lying. I sighed. Jill, I'm 16, Dad. I'm not stupid. Her voice wavered, but she held my gaze. I see the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to find the right words. How do you explain to your daughter that the person you built your life with had broken something that could never be fixed? Finally, I just told her the truth. Your mom made a mistake, I said carefully. A big one. Jill swallowed hard. She cheated. I nodded. She sucked in a sharp breath, and for a moment, I thought she might yell, cry, lash out. But she just stood there, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. How long? She asked. I don't know. She exhaled shakily. Are you divorcing her? I hesitated. Then, yes. Jill nodded once, sharply. Then she turned and walked away. I let her go. Some wounds needed space to bleed before they could begin to heal. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Katie found me sitting on the back porch. The summer air was thick with humidity, the scent of freshly cut grass lingering in the breeze. I was nursing a glass of whiskey, staring at the stars, thinking about everything and nothing at once. She slid into the chair across from me, hesitating before she spoke. Do you really want to do this? I took a slow sip before answering. I don't want to do this, Katie, but I don't see another choice. She swallowed, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. I love you. I scoffed. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Her face twisted with pain. I don't know why I did it. I turned to her then, meeting her eyes. You don't know. She shook her head. I was lonely, Bill. You don't see it, but you've been distant for years. It's like we were living side by side, but you weren't really there. I stared at her, absorbing the weight of her words. She wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the way, I had let routine take over. I had stopped looking at her the way I used to, stopped noticing the little things. Maybe I had assumed she would always be there, that love was something that could be put on autopilot. But none of that justified what she had done. Then you should have talked to me, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Not found comfort in another man's bed. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I know. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she whispered, Can you ever forgive me? I let out a long breath, staring at the night sky. I don't know, I admitted, but I know I can't stay married to you. She let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth with her hand. It should have hurt to say it. Maybe it did. But more than anything, I just felt tired. There was no going back. The next morning, I made the call to a divorce attorney. Katie didn't fight me on it. Maybe she knew she had already lost. Over the next few weeks, we worked out the details, custody arrangements, splitting assets, the logistics of untangling two lives that had been intertwined for so long. The hardest part was telling the girls. Jenny sobbed, clinging to Katie like a lifeline, begging her to fix it. Jill sat in stony silence, her jaw clenched, her eyes burning with betrayal. There was nothing I could say to make it easier. Some pains just had to be felt. Katie moved out 2 months later. The day she left, she hugged the girls tightly, whispering promises of love, of weekend visits, of things eventually feeling normal again. Then she turned to me. I'm so sorry, Bill, she murmured. I nodded. Take care of yourself, Katie. She hesitated, like she wanted to say more. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked out the door. I watched from the window as she drove away. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt free. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as I walked along the lake's edge. The girls were a few yards ahead, skipping stones across the glassy surface, their laughter echoing through the quiet forest. It had been months since the divorce was finalized, and though the pain still lingered in the quiet moments, I found solace in days like this, simple, pure, untouched by the past. For the first time in years, I wasn't pretending to be okay. I was. I watched Jill as she showed Jenny how to angle her wrist just right, sending a smooth, flat stone skimming across the water. Their bond was unshaken by the storm we had endured. If anything, they had grown stronger, more resilient. I envied them in a way. As I stood there, hand in my pockets, I thought about how much had changed. The house felt emptier now, but not in a bad way. It was peaceful. No more forced conversations. No more walking on eggshells. I had repainted the kitchen last month, choosing a deep blue to replace the dull beige that Katie had loved. I wanted something that felt like me. I was still learning who that was. After an hour at the lake, we packed up and headed into town for lunch. The coffee shop on Main Street had always been my go-to spot, but I hadn't been back since the divorce. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I had been avoiding the familiarity of it, afraid it would remind me of the person I used to be. As we stepped inside, the rich aroma of roasted beans and warm pastries wrapped around me like an old friend. The place was unchanged, same worn wooden floors, same chalkboard menu, same cozy hum of conversation. Then I saw her. Missy. She was standing behind the counter, adjusting the sleeve of her uniform, her arm finally free of the cast. When she spotted me, her eyes brightened with recognition. Well, look who it is, she said, grinning as she wiped her hands on her apron. Haven't seen you in a while, Bill. Yeah, I guess I've been keeping a low profile, I admitted. She leaned on the counter, studying me. You look different. I raised an eyebrow. That a good thing? She tilted her head, as if deciding. Yeah, yeah, I think it is. Her smile was easy, genuine. It had been a long time since someone had looked at me like that. Without pity, without judgment. The girls ordered their drinks, chattering excitedly about their skipping stone victories. Missy handed me my coffee, her fingers brushing mine for just a second too long to be accidental. I heard about everything, she said quietly. I nodded. Yeah, it's been a year. She hesitated before speaking. You deserved better. I let out a small laugh. I think I'm finally starting to believe that. Her eyes softened. Good. I wasn't sure what was happening in that moment, but something shifted. A weight lifted, a door cracked open. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about possibility, about realizing that not everyone would betray me. That maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought. That night, after I tucked the girls into bed, I stood on the back porch, watching the stars. The air was cool against my skin, carrying the distant scent of rain. For so long, I had defined myself as a husband, a provider, a man who endured. But now I was something else, something new. I pulled out my phone and stared at Missy's number. A week ago, I wouldn't have considered it. But tonight, with the stars shining above and the weight of my past finally loosening its grip, I sent a message. Hey, thanks for today. It was nice seeing you. A minute later, my phone buzzed. It was nice seeing you too. I smiled to myself, taking a deep breath. I didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. The price of betrayal, a wife's ultimate regret. Laura sat at the dimly lit corner of the hotel lounge, swirling the last of her wine in its glass. She hadn't planned to stay this long. The networking event was supposed to be just that, networking. Shake hands, exchange business cards, engage in small talk that led nowhere. But then she met him. Pete Hour. Charming, confident, and effortlessly magnetic, he carried himself like a man who had never known failure. His suit was tailored to perfection. His watch gleamed under the soft glow of the bar lights, and his smirk carried just enough arrogance to make him dangerously appealing. Laura had laughed at one of his jokes, something about their industry's obsession with meaningless jargon, and that was it. A spark, the kind she hadn't felt in years. She was used to stability, a steady marriage, 3 kids, a husband, David, who was everything a woman could ask for, reliable, patient, a good father. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He was safe. With Pete, there was possibility. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, beyond the usual pleasantries. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone. How she sometimes felt invisible in her own home. How she had traded passion for responsibility, adventure for routine. Pete listened, his gaze never wavering. And then, just as she was about to leave, he leaned in slightly, his voice low. Maybe you don't have to choose between the two. That was the first thread of the web. Over the next few weeks, the texts came late at night. First about work, then about everything else. Pete's marriage, he claimed, was a cage. A relationship where 2 people coexisted, pretending they were still in love. Like roommates, he had said. Laura had nodded, understanding too well. And then, one evening, Pete made his move. Come with me, he had whispered over the phone. 2 weeks. Bali. No responsibilities. No pretending. Just us. The words sent a thrill down her spine. She wanted to say no. She should have said no. But instead, she hesitated. That was all it took. Pete sensed it. You deserve more, Laura. And in that moment, she believed him. Laura was meticulous. If she was going to take this step, she would do it her way. She crafted a careful narrative, a business trip, a required training course that just happened to be out of state. She arranged for her in-laws to take the kids. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. But before she left, she did something impulsive, something reckless. She wrote a letter. Not a confession, not exactly. More like an explanation. A justification. She placed it under David's pillow, knowing he wouldn't find it until she was already gone. It read, "David, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just write it. For years, I have been trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother. I've given everything to this family. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I feel like a shadow of the woman I used to be. And the worst part? I don't think you even see it. I need to do something for me, for once. I don't know what this means for us yet, but please understand, I never wanted to hurt you. Laura." She wasn't sure why she wrote it. Maybe, deep down, she wanted to be caught. Maybe she wanted David to fight for her, to prove that he still saw her. Or maybe she just wanted to believe she wasn't a villain. Either way, the letter was there, and it would change everything. The night before her flight, Laura kissed her children goodnight as if nothing was wrong. Daniel, 16, barely looked up from his phone. Larry, 13, grumbled about school. Sarah, the youngest at 10, hugged her the tightest. "Don't be gone too long, Mom," Sarah whispered into her shoulder. Laura forced a smile. "I won't." But she knew she was lying. At the airport, Pete was waiting. He flashed her that confident grin, the one that made her feel chosen. Special. As they checked in for their flight, Laura let herself believe, just for a moment, that she was doing the right thing. That this was freedom. But freedom always comes at a cost. And hers was waiting for her back home. Waiting to be discovered. The airport hummed with the chaotic energy of restless travelers. The scent of burnt coffee and duty-free perfume thick in the air. Laura sat beside Pete at gate 37, her manicured nails drumming lightly against her boarding pass. Excitement and nerves battled within her. She was about to board a plane to paradise with a man who made her feel alive again. Pete stretched his legs, checking his watch for the third time. 15 minutes till boarding, he murmured. Laura smiled, but before she could reply, Pete's phone vibrated on the seat between them. He glanced at the screen, and, in an instant, his entire demeanor shifted. His relaxed posture stiffened, his face drained of color, and his jaw tightened like a clenched fist. "What is it?" Laura asked, leaning closer. He swallowed hard, hesitating before turning the screen toward her. The message was short. "Peter Hour, just touch that woman, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." A chill ran down Laura's spine. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pete exhaled slowly, locking his phone and shoving it into his pocket. "I don't know." "Are you sure?" He hesitated. That moment of hesitation sent Laura's heartbeat into overdrive. "You said your wife doesn't know," she pressed. "She doesn't," Pete insisted, but the unease in his eyes betrayed his confidence. Laura's mind raced. Could David have found out? No. Impossible. She had been careful. And yet, "Someone's watching us," she muttered. Pete ran a hand over his face. "It's probably nothing. Some jealous colleague, maybe, or a prank." But Laura wasn't convinced. The message wasn't a casual threat. It was precise. Peter Hour, a warning, as if the sender knew the exact moment their betrayal would begin. A voice crackled over the speakers, announcing the final boarding call. Pete grabbed his bag. "Come on." Laura hesitated for the briefest second before following him down the jet bridge, but the weight in her chest wouldn't lift. As she buckled her seatbelt, she forced a smile, trying to shake the feeling that somewhere, someone had just set a trap. And she just walked straight into it. Laura sat on the edge of the hotel bed, gripping Pete's phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room smelled of salt air and Balinese incense, but the luxurious surroundings now felt suffocating. Her daughter's voice echoed in her ear. Dad took Daniel and Larry to the cabin. He said he needed time to think. Something was wrong. David never just took the boys to the cabin. That place wasn't a vacation spot. It was an escape, a retreat deep in the woods, where cell service was non-existent and the silence stretched for miles. It was where David went when he needed to clear his mind, to decide things. And now he had taken their sons there, without a word to her. A chill ran down Laura's spine. Did he seem angry? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah hesitated. I don't know, she said. Just different. He was calm, but not normal calm. Like the way he gets when something's already decided. Laura's throat tightened. Decided? She forced herself to breathe. Listen, sweetheart, I need you to do something for me, she said, her voice urgent. Try to call him. If you get through, tell him I want to talk. I already tried. No answer. Laura closed her eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had pictured something else entirely. A tense but manageable confrontation upon her return, maybe some tears, a few bitter fights. Then, over time, they would come to an understanding. Maybe even stay married, but on new terms. A modern arrangement. David wasn't supposed to go silent. He wasn't supposed to disappear with the boys. Mom, Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you okay? Laura opened her mouth to answer, but she didn't know what to say. So she hung up. David sat in front of the stone fireplace, the orange glow flickering across his face. He had built this cabin with his own hands, back when he still believed in things like forever. The letter sat on the coffee table. His wife's confession, in her own handwriting. I love you, but I need more. I never meant to hurt you. Please don't be angry. David had read it a dozen times, but each time, the words blurred together into one simple truth. Laura had made a choice. And so had he. He looked at his sons. Daniel, 16, sat on the couch, hands clasped, jaw tight. Larry, only 13, stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Your mom's gone, David said finally, his voice steady. She chose to be somewhere else. Daniel swallowed hard. Is she coming back? David met his son's gaze. I don't know, but I do know this. I'm not going to let her lie to us anymore. Larry's face twisted. She's a liar. David didn't correct him. Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, Daniel spoke. What happens now? David exhaled, slow and controlled. We move on, together. Larry looked at his father, searching his face for something, comfort, maybe, or certainty. David gave him neither. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a legal document. Filed that morning. A petition for full custody. Laura stood on the balcony of her hotel room, staring at the vast, endless ocean. A paradise she could no longer enjoy. Pete was still asleep inside, oblivious to the storm building inside her. She had called David's phone 10 times. No answer. She tried Sarah again. Voicemail. And she made the call she had been dreading. Her lawyer picked up on the second ring. Laura. His voice was measured. Professional. I need to secure my assets, she said, skipping the pleasantries. David knows. He's making moves. There was a pause. He already froze your accounts this morning. Laura's stomach lurched. What? He restricted all joint assets. Legally, he's within his rights. Her fingers dug into the balcony railing. That's impossible. I should have had time. He was one step ahead. Laura's vision blurred with rage. David had played this perfectly. While she was sipping cocktails in Bali, thinking she was in control, he had dismantled everything. She had underestimated him. And now, she was trapped. In that moment, something inside Laura snapped. She had made a mistake, a big one. But if David thought he could erase her from their children's lives, if he thought he could win, he was wrong. She was not going to let him take her kids away. And if she had to fight him to the bitter end, so be it. She wasn't going down without a war. Laura sat on the hotel balcony, staring at the glittering Bali skyline. The humid air clung to her skin as she sipped from a glass of wine, but the taste was bitter now. Something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not physically, but from afar, like a shadow creeping closer, just beyond her vision. Pete lay sprawled on the bed inside, half asleep, his phone buzzing with work emails. He had been distant lately. The excitement that once burned between them was fading. The secrecy had been thrilling before. Furtive glances, stolen kisses, whispered conversations. Now it just felt exhausting. She checked her phone again. Still no response from David. The children hadn't texted back, either. That wasn't like them. Her fingers hovered over the call button, but something inside her resisted. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe, just maybe, she already knew. David knew. By morning, Laura couldn't stand the silence anymore. She needed reassurance, something solid to hold on to. She grabbed her purse and took a taxi to the bank. If David was giving her the silent treatment, fine, but she needed to make sure her personal assets were untouched. Inside the bank, the marble floors echoed under her heels as she approached the teller. "I'd like to check the balance on my personal account," she said, forcing a smile. The teller typed a few keys, then frowned. "Ma'am, there's a restriction on your account." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" The teller hesitated, lowering her voice. "A legal hold. It was placed this morning by your husband." A strange numbness spread through Laura's chest. She gripped the counter. "Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am. All joint accounts, property investments, and liquid assets are currently frozen under legal review." "I'm sorry." Laura stepped back, her mind racing. David had moved first. But how? How had he found out so quickly? She turned away, pulse hammering. There was only one answer. He had known before she left. Back at the hotel, Laura stormed into the room, her breath uneven. Pete looked up from his phone. "What's wrong?" he asked. "What's wrong?" she echoed, her voice sharp. "David locked my accounts. He's filed something legally. He knows Pete." Pete sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. "How could he know?" "I don't know," she snapped. "But I need to get ahead of this. I need to—" She stopped mid-sentence. Pete wasn't listening. He was checking his phone, scrolling through messages. "Are you even paying attention?" she seethed. "I just have some work stuff," Pete muttered, his eyes flicking between her and the screen. Laura snatched the phone from his hand. Her breath caught. There on his screen was a text. From his wife. "I know everything. Don't come home." Laura's stomach dropped. "Oh my God," she whispered. Pete grabbed the phone back, his face paling. This isn't what it looks like." She stared at him in disbelief. "It's exactly what it looks like, Pete. Your wife found out too." Pete rubbed his temples. "Look, I don't know how she found out, but she found out because David knew." Laura cut in. "And if David knew, he told her." Pete's silence confirmed what she feared. This wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a trap. David had seen the storm coming and had stepped out of the way, letting her walk straight into it. Laura needed a plan. Fast. She dug through her bag, pulling out her laptop. She still had separate investments, a rental property in Sarah's name. If she moved quickly, she could secure them before David tied up everything in legal red tape. But as she logged in, another shock awaited her. Her email was flooded with legal notifications. Petition for full custody, filed this morning. Petition for divorce, filed this morning. Restraining order from financial transactions, approved. It was already happening. David had taken everything before she even knew she had lost it. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She felt like she was drowning. And Pete? Pete was still sitting there, scrolling through his phone, already moving on. He wasn't panicked like she was. He wasn't trapped. Because he had nothing to lose. She turned to him, her voice cold now. "You planned for this, didn't you?" Pete frowned. "What?" "You knew this could happen, so you covered yourself. You never put your own money at risk. You never left anything traceable. You let me take all the risks." Pete's silence told her everything. And for the first time, Laura realized the full extent of her mistake. She had been so focused on escaping one life, she had walked straight into the arms of a man who would never fight for her. David had fought. David had acted. Pete had just been along for the ride. That night, Laura lay awake, staring at her phone. She had called, texted, emailed. Nothing. Not from David. Not from Sarah. Not from any of her children. She was cut off. And the most terrifying part? She wasn't sure she could ever fix it. Laura had never been one to feel true fear until now. As she and Pete stepped off the plane, reality hit her like a blow to the stomach. Gone were the carefree sunsets and secret whispers of Bali. The humid, tropical air was replaced with the cold, sterile atmosphere of the airport terminal, where everything felt sharper, more real. She tried to call David. No answer. Her children? Nothing. Panic set in. Something was wrong. Pete, sensing her unease, pulled out his phone and muttered, "Maybe we're just overthinking this. I'll call my wife and smooth things over." Before he could finish, his phone buzzed. A single text. "I know everything. Don't come home." The blood drained from his face. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. The trap had already been sprung. The next morning, Laura arrived at her lawyer's office, her stomach in knots. Her attorney, Susan Holbrook, was already waiting, her lips pursed, eyes calculating. Susan was a shark, the kind of woman who relished tearing opposing arguments apart in the courtroom. But today, she didn't look like she was preparing for a battle she could win. David had filed for divorce. Not just any divorce, an all-out war. Full custody, asset freezes, evidence of adultery. The documents were placed in front of Laura, thick and neatly stacked, like a carefully arranged execution order. Laura swallowed hard. He can't do this. The house is half mine. We built it together." Susan barely glanced up. "He's filed an emergency injunction to keep you from setting foot on the property." Laura's stomach twisted. "The kids?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've refused contact with you," Susan said, this time looking at her with something close to pity. "They've made their wishes very clear." Laura shook her head. No, that's impossible. Sarah wouldn't do that to me. And Daniel? He's old enough to understand that marriages are complicated. He wouldn't." Susan sighed and pushed a printed email across the table. Laura's hands trembled as she picked it up. It was from Daniel. "Mom, I don't know what you thought would happen, but we're not little kids anymore. We know what you did. You lied to us, to Dad, to everyone. And now you want to come back and pretend like nothing happened? We don't want to see you. You chose Pete. Go live with him. Daniel." A sharp, painful breath escaped her lips. She clutched the paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. Susan watched her carefully. "He's 16, Laura. The court will take his wishes seriously." "But Sarah wrote one too." Laura flinched. She couldn't read another. She didn't need to. Her own children had turned against her. At the courthouse, Laura finally saw David for the first time in weeks. He sat across the table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were something else entirely. Cold, calculated. A man who had once given her everything now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The opposing attorney, Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we'd like to present Exhibit A." A screen flickered on. Security footage. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she watched herself, walking through the airport, arm in arm with Pete. They were laughing, unaware of the cameras tracking their every move. She could practically hear her own words from that moment. "It's just 2 weeks. What's the worst that could happen?" The screen cut to black. Silence. Judge Whitmore folded his hands. "Mrs. Caldwell, would you like to explain?" Laura's mouth was dry. She turned to Susan for help, but even her lawyer seemed weary. The judge wasn't asking because he needed an explanation. He already had everything he needed. There was more. A private investigator's report detailing their entire affair. Bank records showing Laura's failed attempt to move assets out of joint accounts. The letter, the damning, arrogant letter she had left behind, thinking she was in control of the situation. And finally, the statement from her children, testifying that they no longer trusted her. David had played the long game. He had gathered every piece of evidence before she even knew the battle had begun. Laura was a fighter. She wouldn't go down without trying. She begged for joint custody. She swore she'd make things right. She even turned on the tears, hoping for some shred of sympathy. But David never looked at her. Not once. And when the judge finally spoke, it was with an air of finality. Mr. Caldwell is granted full custody of the children. Mrs. Caldwell's visitation rights will be at the discretion of the minors involved. It was over. Her children had been given the power to decide, and they had already chosen. David stood, buttoning his suit jacket. For a brief moment, he looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, just nothing. Laura wanted to scream, to claw at him, to make him see her. But there was nothing left to fight for. He had won, and she had lost everything. Laura sat in her dimly lit apartment, the weight of regret pressing down on her like an iron vice. The apartment smelled of stale wine and unopened bills, her life now reduced to a space barely big enough for her thoughts. She used to have a home, a family. Now she had silence, except for the occasional buzz of a notification that never came from the people who mattered. Her children refused to speak to her. Weeks had turned into months. At first, she had texted them daily, then weekly. Now, she hesitated before sending anything at all, knowing the likelihood of being ignored was close to absolute. But tonight, something inside her snapped. This wasn't fair. David had stolen her life. He had poisoned their children against her. He had orchestrated this entire downfall with precision, ensuring that when she fell, there was no one to catch her. He hadn't just divorced her, he had erased her. And she would not accept it. She picked up her phone, scrolling through old pictures of her family. Her fingers trembled as she found one from 2 years ago, a birthday dinner. David sat at the head of the table, his usual calm presence commanding the room. The kids laughed, unaware of the slow disintegration of their mother's loyalty. She clenched her jaw. He thinks he's won. But he hadn't. Not yet. Laura had spent weeks preparing. She had learned everything she could about David's routine, where he shopped, when he worked out, what time he picked up the kids from school. It was all too easy. He was a creature of habit, a man who believed in structure and control. And that was his weakness. She didn't just want revenge. She wanted to be seen, to remind him that no matter how much he tried to erase her, she still existed. So, she crafted a plan. She would wait for him at the one place where he would be forced to face her, their home. The night was cold, the wind whispering through the trees as Laura stood outside the house she once called home. The porch light was on, casting a golden glow over the welcome mat. The same mat she had picked out years ago, the same mat she had wiped her shoes on every evening after work, the same mat that now belonged to a world she had been exiled from. Through the window, she saw them, David and the children, gathered in the living room. They were watching a movie, curled up on the couch with blankets and popcorn, a scene so perfect it made Laura's stomach churn with rage and sorrow. It should have been her. She took a deep breath and knocked. A moment later, David opened the door. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, he looked bored, as if this moment had played out in his mind long before she ever decided to show up. Laura. His voice was flat, emotionless. Her heart pounded. I need to see them. David didn't move. No. Laura swallowed. David, please. I'm still their mother. A flicker of something, anger perhaps, flashed in his eyes. You stopped being their mother the moment you chose someone else over them. Her hands clenched into fists. I didn't choose anything. I was lost. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you get to turn them against me. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You think this is about me? Laura, they don't want to see you. You broke their trust. They made that decision. No, her voice wavered. They're just listening to you. You. She stopped herself, realizing how desperate she sounded. She took a step closer, her voice softer. David, you know me. You know I love them. You know I love you. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of amusement. And then, laughter. Not the warm laughter she had once adored, but cold, cruel laughter. You love me? he repeated. No, Laura, you love the idea of me. You love the security, the stability, the way I made you feel safe. But when you had a chance to be free, to chase your happiness, you didn't hesitate. She shook her head, her eyes burning. I was wrong. David's expression hardened. Yes, you were. She reached out, trying to touch his arm, but he stepped back. David, go home, Laura. His voice was like stone. If you even have one. The door shut. And just like that, she was outside again. Alone. The cold seeped in her bones as she stood there, frozen in place, staring at the door that had just closed in her face. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be unwanted. She didn't remember the drive back to her apartment. The streetlights blurred, her vision clouded by unshed tears. By the time she reached her empty, silent apartment, the weight of everything crushed her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear something apart. But there was nothing left to destroy. So she poured herself a drink. And then another. And another. She had wanted revenge. Instead, she had been annihilated. And David? David had won. The years had not been kind to Laura. She sat alone in a dimly lit apartment, the flickering streetlight outside casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The place smelled faintly of old coffee and forgotten dreams, just like her life. The woman who once commanded attention in boardrooms and turned heads at parties was now a ghost of herself, a faded version of the woman David had once loved. She had tried, in the beginning, to piece her life back together. After the court ruling, she fought for months to reconnect with her children. She called. She sent letters. She even showed up at their school once, standing at a distance, hoping for a glance of familiarity, a moment of recognition. But all she saw was the way they turned away from her. Sarah, once her little girl who used to braid her hair in the mornings, had stared at her with a look Laura could only describe as disgust. Larry, the quiet one, had refused to even acknowledge her presence. And Daniel, her firstborn, the one she had always thought would understand, had walked past her as if she were nothing more than a stranger in the crowd. They had chosen David. Of course they had. David had been the one who stayed, the one who wiped their tears, attended their school plays, and held them when they cried about the mother who abandoned them. The realization cut deeper than she had expected. The truth settled in her bones, cold and immovable. She hadn't just betrayed David. She had betrayed them all. One afternoon, years later, Laura found herself driving through familiar streets, past the park where she once pushed Sarah on the swings, past the cafe where she and David used to share quiet Sunday mornings. She hadn't meant to, but her hands had guided her to the one place she had no right to be. David's house. Not their house. Not anymore. From her car, she could see the life she used to have. The front porch light was on, a warm glow spilling onto the neatly trimmed lawn. Laughter drifted from the backyard, her children's laughter. And then she saw them. David was standing on the porch, arms wrapped around a woman. A younger woman, perhaps in her late 30s. She was laughing at something he said, leaning into him with a familiarity that made Laura's stomach twist. His new wife. The woman who now had the life Laura had thrown away. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out, now a grown woman. She looked happy, radiant even. Behind her, Larry and Daniel followed, and Laura felt her heart crack a little more. They looked so whole, so complete, as if she had never even existed. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to scream, to step out of the car and remind them that she had been a part of their lives, once, that she had loved them. But deep down, she knew love wasn't enough when trust had been shattered. So she sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, watching the life that had moved on without her. And then she did the only thing left to do. She drove away. Laura spent her nights in silence now. No more late-night phone calls from friends. No more texts from lovers. The men who had once pursued her, the ones who had found her exciting, dangerous, intoxicating, they had all disappeared when the scandal had settled. She thought about reaching out to Pete once, but she knew it was pointless. He had crawled back to his wife, probably swearing he had been manipulated, that it was all Laura's fault. Maybe it was. In the end, she was the one left with nothing. David had won, but it wasn't a victory he had needed to fight for. She had handed it to him, gift wrapped in deceit and betrayal. And the cruelest part? His revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. He had erased her. And that, more than anything, was the punishment she never saw coming.